In today's lecture, we will be talking about the Roaring Twenties, that is the aftermath of World War I. Here we will discuss the popular perception surrounding entertainment, the rise of consumer culture, and tensions surrounding racism. After 1922, employment dropped to record lows and real wages rose in most sectors, securing for many American industrial workers the highest standard of living in the world. For the first time, consumer goods, especially automobiles and home appliances, played a crucial role in the growing economy. Production expanded at lightning speed through 1929, by which time factories were pumping out 64% more consumer goods than in 1920. The chief engines of this boom were the federal government's pro-business policies, the advent of easier credit, changes in advertising and media networks, and the spread of Henry Ford's model of a high-wage, high-consumption economy. Get-rich-quick schemes abounded, and for the first time, large numbers of workers invested. Many profited, but hundreds of thousands of people lost their life savings. Although elected on an anti-progressive platform, President Warren Harding filled his cabinet with a mix of conservatives, businessmen, and some independents with progressive credentials. Harding's declaration at his inauguration in 1921 that he would return the country to normalcy was, in practice, a blend of conservative and progressive principles. On Harding's request, lawmakers cut wartime luxury taxes in 1921 and reduced the highest income tax rate to 33%. 2 years later, the administration persuaded Congress to lower corporate taxes and cut the upper income tax rate again to just 25%. The Federal Trade Commission ceased to enforce the antitrust laws that progressives had championed. Designed to create an environment favorable to business, these policies generated an infusion of cash into the economy, which in turn stimulated investment. But Harding did not pursue a purely laissez-faire policy of small government, as is popularly believed. Some parts of government, including the Department of Commerce, expanded dramatically. Under Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover's guidance, the corporate sector established voluntary trade associations which set industry-wide standards for goods and services along with voluntary wage and price controls. Federal agencies also distributed all kinds of information that was useful for business, including production statistics and trade forecast. Internationally, the Harding administration rejected Wilsonian diplomacy and refused to join the League of Nations. The United States quietly moved away from the military interventionism of the progressive era. America did not retreat into isolationism, however. The United States, Britain, France, and Germany signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928, prohibiting war among the signatories. The United States recognized Mexico's government in exchange for compensation for the American property losses during the Revolution and signed the Washington Naval Treaties in 1921-22, under which Japan, Britain, France, and Italy pledged to suspend the renewed naval arms race and to honor America's open door policy. Most significantly, Harding eased the way for U.S. trade and investment overseas by dispatching trade attaches, expanding overseas embassies, and facilitating the flow of information between host countries and American business. Corporations such as Ford Motors and Hollywood's MGM Studios opened dozens of production facilities in Europe, Latin America, and Australia. American production methods became highly influential even in communist Russia, whose leader proclaimed Ford's assembly line the key to modernization. Advertisers both boosted sales and changed people's attitude towards money, consumption, and the meaning of happiness. Aware that mass advertising was critical to consumption, business spent on average $3.2 billion on advertising each year, about 50% more than the nation spent annually on K-12 education. The volume of magazine, billboard, and newspaper advertising more than quadrupled between 1917 and 1929, aiming to stimulate mass desire to consume. Advertising used a host of new strategies to convince Americans that purchasing the latest goods would lead to health, happiness, and prosperity. Adopting the tie-in technique that the federal government had used to great effect during the World War I, advertisers recruited baseball players and movie stars, linking their material success and happiness with the advertised products. The new approach invited ordinary people to fantasize about the good life and the possibility that they could attain the lifestyle of the rich and famous. Advertisers also attempted to elevate their trade to respectable occupation, pressing business schools to offer classes in marketing and advertising and publishing a plethora of manuals on the so-called science of selling. When studies revealed that 4 of every 5 purchasers of consumer goods were women, many commentators correctly argued that the traditional working family, headed by a male breadwinner who made most budgetary decisions, was obsolete. The typical American man, observed Christine Frederick in her leading manual, Mrs. Consumer, seems to enjoy himself most at earning, while content to leave the pleasure of spending to his women. Such a condition puts buying power into women's hand on a tremendously broad scale. Targeting white women became the new standard in advertising, and the psychology of women came to be the principal object of study. Although most white advertisers reinforce the color line by ignoring black consumers or by drawing on stereotypical images. Advertisements implicitly warned women that failure to use a particular deodorant or detergent would cause social embarrassment, or worse. New etiquette books encouraged women to see products as necessities that once were luxuries. In advertising and cinema, the rail thin figure replaced the hourglass Gibson girl, and dieting programs, books, and aids became popular for the first time. A lucrative beauty industry responded to and shaped young women's changing mode of self-presentation. Beauty shops increased eightfold during the decade, and the millions of young women adopted fad diets such as the Hollywood 18-day diet, which allowed only 585 calories a day, about a quarter of 2000 calories that the US Drug and Food Administration recommends for women today. The world's fast broadcasting system, radio, increased the spread of consumer culture. Although hobbyists had used radio since 1910s, it was not until 1922 that manufacturers and advertisers recognized that it offered unprecedented access to consumers. Unlike other communication systems, it did not require enormous amount of land, labor, and money to build. Once the business world reconceptualized radio as a mass advertising network, thousands of companies began operating stations. Western Electric and General Electric manufactured receivers that were more appealing to consumers, substituting loudspeakers for the old headphones and redesigning the sets to resemble elegant furniture. The same companies made millions of homes radio ready by connecting them to electricity grid, doubling the proportion of homes with electricity. Advertising generated much needed revenue for radio, while radio extended advertisers' reach to audiences of tens of millions of people. Local businesses and national corporations frequently sponsored radio shows, and many also recorded advertisements for their products. By 1925, approximately 10% of all homes had a radio. 5 years later, 1 in 3 families owned a radio, and most Americans got their news that way rather than from newspapers. Like the internet in 1990s, radio quickly transformed everyday life. Young people in small towns everywhere heard the latest jazz from cosmopolitan cities and gathered together to dance to the radio. Live broadcasts of performances from dance halls, opera houses, and symphony halls were popular, expanding the audience to a truly national one. Housewives tuned in for cooking and homemaking shows, many built around the products of their sponsors. Families and neighbors gathered at radio parties and on Sundays listened to nationally renowned evangelical preachers. Along with advertising and radio, greater access to credit and changing attitudes towards debt speed the transition to a consumer-oriented economy. Consumer credit, which was not available to most Americans before 1920, expanded dramatically when General Motors offered an installment plan which enabled people to put down a deposit and drive home with a new car. Such plans boosted car sales threefold, accounting for 75% of new car sales by 1924. Consumers and most manufacturers rapidly embraced the system. By 1929, installment purchases accounted for 60% to 90% of all big-ticket goods, including vacuum cleaner, radios, and automobiles. Rules governing house mortgages were relaxed in some areas, and home buyers had to pay only 10% instead of the formidable 50% as a down payment. For the first time, going into debt for the sake of consumption was respectable, but not everyone could partake. Most companies and banks offering these new forms of credit either disqualified black and other minority Americans or charged them higher interest rates on the basis of their race. Black people, already confined largely to lower wage work, mostly did not benefit from the overall rise in the standard of living. Debarred from taking out a home mortgage, most were also denied access to the single most important builder of personal wealth in the 20th century, the home ownership. By 1920, for the first time ever, a majority of Americans lived in cities, and 19 million more urbanized in the course of the decade. Most dwelled in big metropolitan centers such as St. Louis, San Francisco, and New York, but almost as many Americans inhabited mid-sized towns of between 10 and 100,000 people. Urbanization fed the growth of a culture industry that provided entertainment on a massive scale and drove out thousands of smaller independent companies. Baseball team owners built giant new stadiums to attract tens of thousands of spectators and, with the help of radio and newsreels, turned the national pastime into a mass spectacle. City life completed the shift away from the 19th century Victorian values of thrift, modesty, and restraint to a modern emphasis on personal expression through consumption. Movies, advertising, and the tabloids presented the underground culture of nightclubs and bars as glamorous, and the popular perception that individuals were free to consume as they saw fit encouraged people to flout prohibition. In the cities, people in their 20s identified for the first time as a distinctive new generation. Emulating big screen stars, young women broke with decades of tradition by bobbing their hair, cutting their hair short, and entering nightclubs and restaurants unaccompanied by men. Although Black Americans encountered new barriers in the cities of the North, they also forged groundbreaking forms of musical, literary, and visual art. Prohibition both suppressed national alcohol consumption by an estimated 60% and stimulated the growth of country's fast, large-scale criminal syndicates. An army of bootleggers manufactured or smuggled liquor. Even more commonly, suppliers diverted alcohol intended for industrial use and redistilled it as a drinkable substance. Farmers and workers who could not afford such black market drink brewed their own beer and moonshine. In the big cities, urban gangs transformed themselves into sophisticated business enterprises that smuggled, distilled, or redistilled beverages. Mixing violence with conventional business techniques, these crime syndicates provided not only the alcohol but also the venues for drinking it. Over 700,000 Black Americans poured into northern cities between 1920 and 1930, continuing their great migration from the South in search of wage work and a better and freer life. Once settled, the majority of newcomers rented apartments in mostly black neighborhoods, such as Chicago's South Side and Detroit's Black Bottom. As black men went to work in unskilled and semi-skilled industrial work, black women typically found employment as domestic servants for white families. At the beginning of the decade, most workplaces, public schools, and city parks and recreational sites were racially diverse. When white people began leaving the city for new suburban developments, however, the public schools grew less diverse. Moreover, when municipalities made public amenities co-ed for the first time, they also segregated them racially, out of the prejudiced belief that black men could not be trusted around white women. Yet the entrenched white prejudice that kept black people living and recreating in their own neighborhoods also made those neighborhoods relatively autonomous. A small but growing minority of migrants were lawyers, doctors, and other professionals, many of whom were self-employed and could afford to purchase a home. But these professionals bumped up hard against the institutional segregation that had taken root earlier in the century. Although the North was free of segregationist legislation, many key business institutions adopted racially exclusive rules. Suburban developers provided the sale of lots and houses to black people, and restrictive covenants that prevented white homeowners from selling to black people became widespread. Real estate agencies adopted similarly racist regulations, and many bankers agreed not to extend mortgages to aspiring black homeowners. Almost all refused mortgages for properties in white neighborhoods. Banks also systematically charged higher interest rates on the few loans they did grant black clients on the questionable grounds that they were more of a risk. Insurance agents agreed to withhold home insurance. From Berkeley, California to Long Island, New York, institutional discrimination was the norm by 1930. The NAACP fought a number of cases, both high profile and more ordinary, against these racist practices, with mixed results, of course. Of all the new, predominantly black neighborhoods, Harlem in Manhattan proved an especially strong magnet for black Southerners. Migrants made up roughly 30% of Harlem's population in 1920 and over 76% by the end of the decade. Here flourished a remarkable community of talented young black writers, artists, and intellectuals, most of whom were part of the small but growing black middle class. This cultural and intellectual development was called the Harlem Renaissance. Central to Harlem's Renaissance was the renewed sense of pride many black people felt in the wake of World War I. Harlem writer Alan Locke rejected the idea, common among whites, that black people lacked culture and instead defined that the black as a person who took pride in being both African descent and American. Many Harlem intellectuals and artists sought to express and make sense of the experience of Great Migration and the excitements and challenges of life in northern cities. For most part, they were not overtly political. As Harlem Renaissance unfolded in the early 1920s, Chicago emerged as the capital of jazz. Initially performing only in black communities, jazz bands were enthusiastically received in Paris during World War I and later debuted in American nightclubs. In 1920s, gangsters who owned the nightclubs were among the first to employ jazz bands and pay the musicians a decent wage. Spurred by hot jazz, whose blazingly fast tempo appealed to dance lovers, the record business by 1923 was issuing thousands of jazz recordings a year. In a sign of the times, however, many of these tunes were recorded by white bands because the record companies felt white consumers would find it more palatable. But Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five and other black bands eventually conquered the radio market as well. By the mid-1920s, Harlem's Cotton Club and Apollo Theater were attracting young white urban sophisticates, many of them the children of upper middle class professionals. Since 1910s, these slummers, as they were often called, had been gradually casting off the Victorian morality they associated with older generations. Slummers experienced urban modernity with its cinemas, theaters, and relative degree of anonymity as liberating. They thrilled to the sights and sounds of immigrant, black, and bohemian neighborhoods, such as San Francisco's Wall Streets and Chicago's South Side. In their eyes, black music, art, and other cultural forms were more real, vital, and lively than their parents' culture. Well-heeled, many also enjoyed the feeling of breaking white society's double taboo against socializing with black Americans and poor people. The most vivid and for some threatening emblem of new youth culture was the flapper. The young women known as flappers embodied a new, more assertive femininity in the way they dressed, spoke, and interacted with men. These young women, white and black, self-consciously transgressed gender conventions by smoking cigarettes and drinking gin cocktails and dancing in ways that involve far more physical contact and flirtation with the opposite sex than Victorian convention permitted. Young women's newfound independence was made possible partly by the disposable income that came with their employment as telephone operators, clerical workers, department store assistants, or in the case of black women, domestic servants. Yet the great majority still aspired to marry and have children, and most stepped into the familiar role of homemaker before the age of 25. Meanwhile, those members of their mother's generation who had struggled long and hard to win women's voting rights extended their fight for equality. Black feminists called on white suffragists to help restore voting rights in the South, where virtually all black adults were deprived of the vote. White feminists, overwhelmingly middle class, were more concerned with the economic and legal status of the white northern women. Not everyone welcomed the momentous cultural changes of the 1920s, and a significant minority embraced some aspects of modern American life while vehemently rejecting others. Around 65% of Americans were white Protestants in 1920s, and millions, particularly white Protestants living in smaller cities and rural areas, believed that bootleggers, flappers, movie stars, Catholic and Jewish immigrants, and black Americans threatened traditional values and morality. The KKK attracted millions of these people through its calls to enforce prohibition and racial purity, support the patriarchal family, and end mass immigration. Later, the Roman Catholic Church also targeted Hollywood's glamorous depictions of sin and negative portrayals of clergy and police. Conservative Protestant clergy broke away from the established churches to rally rural and newly urbanized people around a new Christianity that blended old and the new values. In California and the Southwest, Mexican Americans and growing number of Mexican immigrants were targets. KKK mounted consumer boycotts against minority-owned businesses and shut down nightclubs. Accused adulterers and suspected communists were subject to beatings. Occasionally, KKK perpetrated racial violence on a large scale. In Florida, KKK led a white mob that massacred over 30 black citizens after they tried to vote in the election of 1920. 2 years later, KKK members destroyed the independent black town of Rosewood, Florida, killing unknown numbers of black people. The deadliest massacre in these years occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. The city's Greenwood neighborhood was home to America's largest, most prosperous black middle class. White resentment boiled over after a white woman accused a black elevator operator of sexually assaulting her. Enraged, white mobs shot and killed 300 black citizens and burned over 35 square blocks of Greenwood. Hundreds of black people were seriously injured and over 6,000 were detained for over a week. Their neighborhood wiped off the face of earth and their wealth stolen or destroyed.